And Maja will introduce me and then we will start. Dođi ti, dođiš da dođiš ovdje.
Ne, ja se uvijek stojam, samo ne nikako počnem.
Stolicu sedila.
Znači, kako vika нашиот Гане Тодоровски, колку сме, толку сме, толкму сме. Почитувани колеги, ми представува посебно задоволство што еве денес во мала група, ама се собравме да го проследиме предавањето на колешката Бојана Радовановиќ, кое што е всушност предвидено со научната програма на Сдруженијето на историчари на Република Македонија во соработка со Филозофскиот факултет. Во оваа прилика им благодарам на колегите за логистичката поддршка и на деканот професор доктор Радко Дуев. Знаеме дека годинавани се 70 години од основањето на Сдруженијето и 150 години од раѓањето на Гоце Делчев, два значајни јубилеа, и по тој повод председателството на Сдруженијето организира повеќе научни трибини и циклус предавања. Всушност почнуваме со предавањето на колешката Радовановиќ, а насловот на нејзиното предавање е Средновековна Македонија и нејзината медијална улога во балканското богомилство, центар и крстосница на книжевноста, православието и хетеродоксијата. Накратко само сакам да кажам дека Бојана Радовановиќ е класичен филолог, докторира на оделението на историја на Универзитетот во Виена на тема јазикот на Ереста во грчките и латинските текстови од 9 век, компаративни перспективи. Во моментот е на постдокторски престој во Холандија на оделението за текстуални, историски и систематски студии на јудеизмот и христијанството на Факултетот за филозофија, теологија и религиски студии во рамките на Радбут Универзитетот во Најмеген, финансиран од Австрискиот фонд за наука. Незиниот проект Sicut Oves in Medio Luporum, Religious Landscape, Dualist Descent and the Language of Heresy, 11th-13th century, се однесува на дуалистичките ереси во периодот од 11 до 13 век, а незиниот научен интерес во поширок контекст го опфаќа доцна античкиот паганизам, средновековните ереси, парабиблиските наративи и елементите на мистичната теологија, апокрифите и хетеродоксијата на Балкан. Во последниве 2 години на Радбут Универзитетот држи предавање од областа на византиската теологија, патристиката и раното христијанство. Сега ми е посебно задоволство да и препуштам на Бојана да реализира предавање.
Хвала.
And also I would like to thank to all the participants from which are here with us in online way.
Thank you, Maja. Hvala. And yes, I wish to thank all of you. First, to thank Maja and the Institute of History and Faculty of Philosophy and Mitko for inviting me. And I'm very happy to be here, very flattered and honored. I thank all the attendees, as well as our online colleagues and guests. So I will speak about medieval Macedonia, as Maja has nicely said, and I thank Maja for this nice introduction. This paper will expose the continuity and importance of medieval Macedonia in the aspects implying geographical position of Macedonia, as well as nodal literary and spiritual central position of Macedonia, starting from antiquity to the Middle Ages in respect of history, geography, literature, ethnic diversity, and especially heterodoxy. So the aim is to map the liminal zones of transfer and the contacts of orthodoxy and heterodoxy between East and West. To do that, we start first with the Balkans. Generally, the Slavic Balkans are seen as one of the 4 different ends of the Roman Empire. This has already been proposed in scholarly circles. That means that the medieval Balkans, lying between West and East, can therefore be observed in a twofold aspect, as a confluence of the currents pouring in from Byzantium and West Europe, but also not only as a space in between, but as a bridge and an intersection, a cross intersection, which facilitated the further transfer of people, goods, ideas, doctrines, and texts, Christian and non-Christian beliefs. Also, dualist heresies and other non-Christian currents present in the Balkans of this time can be understood as a segment of a larger heritage, and perhaps to a certain extent as a common denominator of the non-Christians in the Balkans. That means, importantly, when we speak of Macedonia, we can see that it occupied roughly the center of the Balkan space. And in this respect, we shall see that Bogomilism also can be observed as a conceptual center. Macedonia can be observed as conceptual center regarding Bogomilism because it apparently originated there and spread further. The Balkan corridor facilitated the transfer of people and ideas ever since late antiquity. The important routes passing through the Balkans have held a significant role in communication and exchange since the Roman times. The revival of the Balkan and Danube routes took place in the 9th century, which substantially contributed to communication networks in the centuries that followed. It is exactly via these 2 corridors that the roads heading from east entered West Europe. Furthermore, according to Michael McCormick, the Danubian and Southern Passage is a phenomenon whose significance has not been recognized. So, interestingly, the main roads stretching throughout the Balkans served as a corridor, allowing the transfer of both Orthodox but also non-Orthodox currents, as demonstrated, as we shall see on the example via Egnatia. So it is also important to study the role of nodal points, such as Ohrid and Via Egnatia, for both Orthodox and heterodox currents and people. So the medieval Balkans, together with Macedonia, should be contextualized as a transit zone and a contact zone, and in which external influences from Byzantium, Rome, and West Europe collided as well, and it should be examined how the diffusion of religious elements occurred. First, what we know is that already at the end of the 3rd century, starting from antiquity, the reforms of Diocletian had Macedonia assigned to the Diocese of Mysia. In the first half of the 4th century, during Constantine's reign, it was transferred under the jurisdiction of Illyricum. What is important to say that later we had the area of Macedonia suffered destructions, chiefly due to the Gothic incursions in the 3rd century, when most towns were razed and never built again. Then the barbarian menace reappeared again in the Battle of Hadrianopolis in 387, when the Gothic squads ravaged again the interior of the peninsula. The Byzantine border on Danube gave way to the Hunnic onslaught and etc. At the time, we had Stobi and Heraclea Lyncestis, or Bitola, were razed, Dyrrhachium and Salona taken, and the surroundings of Thessaloniki pillaged. So what is important to say that on the territory of the present-day Macedonia, more than 500 fortifications were registered. These were all dated to the late Roman and early Byzantine period. Their number is significantly higher than the available written sources tell us. The information on most of the fortifications comes from summary reports, but only few of them underwent thorough archaeological research. 81 medieval fortifications with antique nucleus have been enlisted. Expressed in percentages, 16.4% of the forts from antiquity have a medieval town or a medieval fortified site which appeared after them. With the Slavic settlement and then with the arrival of the Serbs and Croats, most of Illyricum became colonized by Slavic tribes. But however, there are no historical accounts on these first decades and relations between Byzantium and the Sclavinia in Macedonia. The theme of Macedonia was mentioned already in 802, and the theme of Thessalonica was created following the campaign of Stavrakius. What followed was a massive Christian Romanian colonization in the areas of Strymon, especially in 810 or 11, during the reign of Nicephorus. Plus, I must mention an important point that the Slavic Macedonian population here in Macedonia was probably related to that of the Peloponnese. We had important Slavic population of the Peloponnese, and that is one of the research in course I'm undertaking. Interestingly, in archaeological terms, we have a ceramic vessel dating from the 7th century discovered on the left bank of Bregalnica, while fragments of an urn dating from the 7th century were unearthed on the site Kazanjska Mala in Štip. Ceramic fragments of handmade pottery discovered at Berovo and dating from the 7th and 8th centuries indicate the presence of a Slavic ethnic group around the upper course of the river Bregalnica. And then there is also a bronze mold of Avaro-Slavic type at the site of Bargala by Štip. However, the few findings from the fortified sites dated to the 7th and 8th centuries indicate a non-Slavic population was present. These were attributed to the autochthonous Romaians, bearers of material culture inherently not Slavic, as we have the case of Komani culture, necropolis beside Ohrid. And then on the island of Golem Grad in the Prespa Lake, tombs were discovered containing jewelry of Byzantine Italian type and coins of Constantine IV, as well as Constans II, near Valandovo and at Selce near Prilep. So the restoration of the bishopric of Stobi took place in the late 7th century, and although Stobi had been razed and left depopulated nearly a century before. So here we see the continuity and how it was the important center in Macedonia. On the other hand, more thorough excavations in the lowland positions were never undertaken, not in a way that would yield adequate results. We know that the Archbishopric of Ohrid was reorganized later. What we learn is the established ecclesiastical organization from the Golden Bull of 1272, issued by the Byzantine Emperor Manuel to the Archbishopric of Ohrid. This bull contained copies of the 3 earlier bulls issued by Basil II in the 2nd decade of the 11th century. So we have 17 bishoprics which were listed, and with each episcopal see, towns under its jurisdiction were listed and the number of clerics. In the 2nd bull issued to the Archbishopric of Ohrid, another 14 bishoprics were added to the list, and now we have the total amount of 31 bishoprics. First, Skopje, which was the episcopal see, and the towns of Binec, Lukovo, Preamor, and Princip placed under its jurisdiction. Then Morovišt, with parishes of Kozjak, Slavište, Zletovo, Pijanec, and Maleševo. The 3rd one was Bishopric of Strumica, with its see most likely at the monastery of Veljusa. Towns lying in the jurisdiction of Strumica were Radovište and Konče. And then Bitola, with the following towns: Prilep, Debrešte, and Veles, Pelagonia as well. Ohrid had the following towns attached to it: Kičava, Prespa, and Mokra, and the area of Polog and town of Leskovec were placed under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Pristiana, and Prosek and Morihovo. So, just to say that archaeological findings of reliquary crosses discovered in the vicinity of the ecclesiastical centers could easily be associated with the establishment of the ecclesiastical organization in these areas. These sites include Skopje, Bitola, Ohrid, Strumica, Prilep, Prosep, Lukovica, Kozjak, and Lešak. And an interesting thing is that an amulet with the representation of a Slavic deity discovered at the fortification of Davine near Čučer should be dated to the times before the Slavs in Macedonia were Christianized. So it was also a very important site in Macedonia. We had findings of other non-Christian, like Oriental cults. But we don't have time for this now. And now I would like to say something on the roads, on the important road system. We had Municipium DD was DD was very important road, and at the site of the present-day Sočenica. And from this road, an extension of one of the most important vertical main roads on the Balkan Peninsula stretched along the Ibar River and connected the Adriatic coast and central Bosnia with the south of Balkan Peninsula. The branched road system we had from Skupi, major section of the road, passed through the valley of Vardar via several stations. The branched road system played an important role in the expansion of the Roman domination. And since the barbaric incursions took place along the main roads, it was essential for the Roman Empire to preserve and protect the main road junctions. The devastation of towns in Illyricum opened space for Slavic colonizations of the Balkans, which began during the Emperor Heraclius's reign in the first half of the 7th century. In the central parts of Peninsula, which were intersected by the most important communication lines stretching along the valleys of Morava and Vardar, a number of Roman settlements continued to exist throughout the Middle Ages. One of those was Skupi in Skopje. And then, of course, the very important is Via Egnatia and also Via Militaris. And the third was the road passing through Corinth, with the three main routes that connected the eastern capital of the empire with the west. But they fell out of use in the period between 700 and 866. We know that Italy was connected with Constantinople exclusively by the sea. The ancient Roman Via Militaris connected Constantinople with Great Moravia and also was known as the Moravian Way. However, certain directions of the roads built in antiquity were used later on during the late medieval ages and after the Ottoman conquest, which leads to the conclusion that the new populations must have maintained the roads they had found, at least to a certain measure. As the important Roman traffic ways stretched along the routes of the most favorable natural communications, a considerable part of the ancient road network remained preserved. On the other hand, the local population kept using the benefits of the already existing roads that connected regions and settlements. These were called ancient roads or Via Regia or Via Antica. As I said, one of those very important roads was Via Militaris. And then later also we had the Road of the Pilgrims, which was developed by means also of secondary roads in this and main roads in this region, connecting, for example, Belgrade with Constantinople. And now something more on Via Egnatia. So Via Egnatia was one of the two most important long-distance roads in Macedonia and the Balkans, and the main land route between Constantinople and the Adriatic coast. It connected Constantinople with the Irachian and Albanian coast and Apollonia. Heading to the west, the Egnatian road winds around Lake Ostrovo near the Cele monastic site. Thence it passes through the narrow Kirli-Derven Pass and enters the fertile plain of Pelagonia. Here, in the southern part of Pelagonia, two Armenian villages were mentioned, Armenochor and Armensko. The precise date for the beginning of Armenian settlement remains unknown, but what we know is that Archbishop of Ohrid, Demetrius Chomatinos, mentioned them for the first time during his in the late 12th and early 13th century. When it passes over the modern Greek-Macedonian border, the Via Egnatia heads towards the city of Bitola, the medieval monastic center of Pelagonia. Some of the villages around Bitola, such as Velushina, Bratindol, and Oblakovo Kalujerica in the hills, were noted apparently for their Bogomil activities. The establishment of a small monastery dedicated to the Holy Archangel Gabriel on the western outskirts of medieval Bitola, towards the village of Bratindol, was most probably erected for anti-Bogomil purposes, as it was usually the case. From here, the Ignatian road climbs through the mountainous Javat Pass, through the region of Lake Prespa, and on to the medieval Archbishopric of Ohrid. Finally, it arrives to the Adriatic port of Dyrrhachion. What we know that it is probably the case that the Bogomil doctrine set sail to Brindisi in southern Italy and from there spread to Calabria and Sicily via Via Egnatia, but this remains just to be proved. So now I would like to tell you something more about, for example, Cicero. Cicero mentioned Via Egnatia in his De Provinciis Consularibus. He characterizes the Via Egnatia without calling it by its name as one of the most important roads, Trans-Balkan roads connecting these regions. The recovery, what we know that the recovery of Via Egnatia was attested in 688 when the Emperor Justinian II led the expedition to Thessaloniki. But in the Middle Ages, as we see the heresy spreading in the Balkans and Byzantium, these roads were used by both the Orthodox and heterodox believers, who benefited from the infrastructure already set in place by the very well branched system. Strategically important were the roads and klisuras surrounding the Via Egnatia, such as Klisura of Strymon, for example. This Justinian's expedition was an important step in reopening overland routes in the Balkans. The civilian reopening along Trans-Balkan routes is attested in the 9th century. We have the famous example on the delegation of Louis II, Frankish king, to the Byzantine Emperor Basil I, led by Anastasius Bibliothecarius in 869-70, and the legates of Pope Hadrian II to the Council of Constantinople in the same years. They traveled exactly along Via Egnatia to Dyrrhachion. We know that in the 9th century, the Via Egnatia represented the main artery for diplomatic exchange, as at least until the wars between Byzantium and Tsar Simeon. The Crusaders coming from Germany and France usually came along Austria and Hungary to Belgrade and then along Via Militaris to Niš, Sofia, Philippopolis, and Adrianople. So this is important just to mention the importance of pilgrim roads, and as we have Via Appia, for example, and then later Via Francigena, because all this was connected. For example, so during the pilgrim activities and also the Crusader Wars, these were exactly the roads how we had the pilgrims and the military and armies took these roads most likely. So we have in the middle of the 11th and the middle of the 12th century, we have the two stretches of a Basilike Hodos along the right bank of the Strymon River, via Strumica to Skopje, which are mentioned, and the road over which Nikephoros Gregoras found it so difficult to travel in 1326. In 11th century, just to say that the Frankish anonymous source of the Gesta Francorum speaks of the first crusades and the Macedonian Bogomils, what's very well-known fact. In 1096, the Boimans Normans from Taranto in South Italy, Apulia, coming from Castoria, found a fortified town at the foothill of Pelagonia, around Bitola and Prilep, inhabited by the heretics. The Normans took over the castrum, but the population showed resistance, which is contrary to the pacifist nature of the Bogomils. But usually the scholars are of divided opinion. Some think that these heretics were the Bogomils, like Rački, but some think that they could have been also the Paulicians, who were attested also in Macedonia in the 9th century. So as I said, the Crusader armies took these roads as well. We have the description in the Chronicle of Fulcherius, a participant of the First Crusade. And in the 12th century, Theodore Balsamon spoke on the entire regions which were inhabited by the Bogomils, and he calls them Choria Bogomilica, including the entire fortifications. And probably this information is related exactly to Macedonia. So, however, another branched off sets of secondary roads were important, and secondary roads such as what we know is that the Byzantine delegation took Via Ignatia via Beroia to Ohrid, and Via Ignatia was in service as a main overland road until the end of the 13th century. And infrastructure also existed for private travelers, like inns and hostels. And now we should say something more about the Bogomilism and the religious climate and influences in Macedonia. It is very difficult to say if the pre-Christian pagan Slavic religion was dualist in nature or not. We don't know. We are not sure about that. It still remains to be debated. But could you please switch off your microphones, please, our colleagues who are listening to us. Right. And we know that even in the 500 BC, we know that the boundaries of the Persian Empire stretched from Indus River on the east all the way to the Danube River on the west. And we know that the Persian cults and other Oriental cults expanded to the west, exactly through Armenia, Anatolia, and the Balkans. And many of these traditions mixed. Intermixed. The Bogomilism was at the first sometimes identified as Manichaeism, but we don't know that there is a possibility that there were some Manichaean beliefs present there. It's very probable in Macedonia, but it was also later used as a cliche, like all these dualists like Bogomils and later the Catars were often identified with Manichaeans. So we don't really know if it was, to which extent it was a cliche. According to the 13th century source known as the Synodicon of the Tsar Boril, the leader of the dualist movement was a certain priest called Bogomil, a monastic renegade who propagated heresy in its early stages of the 10th century. We know that to the same Tsar Peter, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Theophylact Lekapenos, wrote a number of letters criticizing the heresy of the Bogomils as Manichaeans mixed with Paulicians. The reign of this pious of the Tsar Peter was known for its dedication to the creation of numerous monasteries and missionary posts around Ohrid, Thessalonica, Bitola, Prilep, and Skopje, the region that subsequently became known as the Second Holy Mountain. The foundation of the monastic milieu in the provinces of Macedonia and Thrace was meant to eradicate the strongholds of the Bogomil movement and refute its ideology. Monks fought against the heretics, and they worked in the region. In the church calendar, they were celebrated as the 7 founding fathers of the Slavonic people, Sedmočislenici, and of these, many were involved in the conversion of Bogomils into Orthodoxy. These 7 included most noted church fathers such as Saint Naum of Ohrid, Prochor of Pšinya, John of Rila, Joachim of Osogovo, and Saint Gabriel of Lesnovo. Saint Naum of Ohrid, in particular, fought against the early Bogomils, as it is shown on an icon kept in the Church of the Holy Mother of God, Perivlepta in Ohrid. The figure of Saint Naum is depicted preaching to the Bogomils at the front of his monastery, with the mountain landscape in the background. The very terrain facilitated the spread of heresy. We have the high range of Rhodope mountains, lakes and valleys, numerous fortifications, which characterize this region in antiquity and the Middle Ages. With the spread of Christianity, important ecclesiastical and regional sees have sprung out, Skupi, Stobi, Ohrid. But at the time of the Bogomil appearance on the historical and religious scene of Europe, the ecclesiastical center, which was in Preslav, was distant enough to react to the emerging Bogomilian hub in Macedonia. What is important to say is also that we have Armenian monophysites attested here in Macedonia as well. And this is also the question, could it have influenced and facilitated the spread of the Paulicians and the Bogomils? Because we know monophysitism is a Christological position which holds that the human nature of Jesus Christ was essentially absorbed by the divine. So this may have some connections to the Docetism, but this is already in another terrain and another topic to discuss. We know that the Bogomils were Docetists, and they called themselves perfecti, or the good ones, the perfect ones. They were ascetic, and I would just like to talk now on the topography and toponyms in Macedonia, which show some elements pointing to the strong Bogomil presence. For example, the name Torbeshi, which we have, which should be compared to Fundagiagite from Asia Minor, is still applied today to the Macedonian Muslim population, directly related to the Bogomil history in the area of Porečje, Reka, and in the district between Šar Planina, Skopje, Debar, and Kičevo. We know that the main monastery of Saint Jovan Bigorski was founded during the 10th century in order to convert the dualist heretical population into Christianity in those regions. The Bogomil centers were the areas west of the river Vardar, between the towns of Tetovo, Debar, Skopje, Prilep, Bitola, Meglena, Vodena, and these were the strongholds of Bogomilism, with the centers on the Babuna mountain and in the village of Bogomila and Melnica. The appearance of Paulician Bogomils in the middle of the 10th century was described in the life of Saint Clement, but we shall come to it later. So, as I said, so one of the accounts says that Pope Bogomil was born in the village Bogomila, which we have here, although some other villages come also into question, like Korab, Gorno Selo, Evli, Oreše, Gromadište, Ževlini, Bistrica, Prisoj. In Korab, there are remains of a church, and also, so it was called today Crkvište. And there is also a church of Saint Elia, which I will show you now. This is here. In the village of Nežilovo, there were caves, for example, which apparently offered shelter to the Bogomils. The grave of Pope Bogomil is, according to some testimonies, located in the mountain Jakupica. But also Mountain Dautica is also mentioned as the Bogomil's place. Pope Bogomil may have been buried in village Sogle, Nežilovo, or Bogomila. It has been said that in some of the aforementioned villages, there were no ecclesiastical funerary rites performed in the village churches, with priests chanting funerary chants, but instead it was held in the houses, after which the corpses would be brought directly to the graveyard. This may suggest the opposition to ecclesiastical sacraments and rites on behalf of the members of the community. It is also believed that Pope Bogomil had spread his doctrine to Dalmatia. And all those who inclined towards the Bogomil faith lived basically north of the Via Egnatia, in the mountains of Moglena, And this well-known medieval region had a mixed population of Slavic, Vlach, Romanized Pechenegs, and Armenian Paulicians. So other zones very important for the spread of Bogomilism are the toponyms around Babuna, the mountain Babuna, 30 kilometers northwards of Prilep. And through which Via Ignatia passed. But also the old important road, Skupi, was passing near the mountain Kleka, which touches Babuna mountain. Babuna is a locality which may be brought into connection with Bogomils, as I said, according to etymology. For example, we know that the term Babun was used as a synonym for Bogomil. In the Slavic Nomocanon from 1262, there is a section entitled related to the Messalians, which we call now Bogomils and Babuns. Đuro Daničić, a famous scholar, etymologically relates the term Babun to Baba, old woman. He says that the Bogomils were called Babuni because their faith was in popular consciousness brought into connection with lay beliefs and magic, and so they were thought of having believed in all women's tales, which can also be brought into connection with accounts of Cosmas the priest and Euthemius Periblepton on Bogomils resorting to kind of incantations. Interestingly, this semantic connotation is also to be found in polemical treatises in Latin, even though from an earlier time. So it entered the polemical literature as a topos in which nenie is the word employed for heretical vain stories, and nenie is also etymologically related to old women tales. Skupi was an important center in pre-Roman and Roman times, and episcopal see until 325. In 4th and the 5th centuries, basilicas were built there. What is important to say, also here is the beautiful views of the Babuna mountain and the terrain, which could have offered shelter to renegade and heterodox like inclined populations like the Bogomils. And another important testimony on the Bogomil center in Macedonia comes from Demetrios Homatenos, Archbishop of Ohrid, who locates the center of the Bogomils in Western Macedonia in the region of Polog, between the towns of Kičevo, Tetovo, and Šar Planina. This region was central in Macedonia, surrounded by 3 sides with hilly, inaccessible mountains, which seems logical as a protection site for heretics. Toponyms throughout Macedonia suggest that the Kudugeri may also refer to Macedonian Bogomils, the term Kudugeri. Simeon, Archbishop of Thessaloniki, spoke on that in the 15th century. He calls Kudugers or Bogomils dualists in surroundings of Thessaloniki, who rejected the ecclesiastical dogmas. But Kudugeris are also mentioned to have lived in Bosnia, as Gennadius Colarius, but Patriarch of Constantinople confirms. But the toponyms are to be found in Macedonia, like 2 Macedonian villages, one at the furthest north in the county of Chustendil. We find there Kutugerci, and the other in the south, Kotugeri, in county of Voden. Etymology of this term is not yet clear and sufficiently explored. So what is important to say now is, here's another beautiful images from this region. Important to say that the roots of the terms Babun, Kudugeri, and Torbeshi are generally found here in Macedonia and not in other parts of the Byzantine Empire to which Bogomilism spread. Furthermore, an important aspect to say is Macedonia was a hub of mixing and mingling peoples from various backgrounds, ethnic and confessional, which attributed to Macedonian ethnic, confessional, and ideological richness and diversity. First, to mention are the Armenians and Paulicians as well. We know that the outbreak of dualist beliefs in the Balkans can be traced to the period following the wars against the Bulgars in the middle of the 8th century. And when the Byzantine emperors Constantine V and Leo IV began to repopulate Thrace, colonizing the Syrian Monophysites, some Messalians and Armenian Paulicians. So Empress Irene drove the Paulicians out of Armenia in the 9th century, and also it was followed by Emperor John Tzimiskes, himself of Armenian origin, who exiled the warlike Paulicians to Plovdiv in Thrace, but also most of heretical Armenian population was resettled along the main roads through the peninsula, such as the Via Militaris and Via Ignatia in Macedonia as well. At the end of the 10th century, Emperor Basil II transported a number of Paulicians to Macedonia. And we know that the great Armenian presence was attested in Thessaloniki, but then they could have taken the Via Ignatia to go further to Macedonia and then to Dyrrhachium and spread further. Right, we know that Saint Hilarion of Moglena speaks on the important number of Armenians and Bogomils who tried to attract Christian population. That is important to say. Macedonia was also a spiritual center, like many monasteries were erected there in the 10th centuries. So the context between the Bogomils and monasteries are important because we know from the sources that Bogomils used to go and to visit the monasteries and pass incognito there. And this may also point to the common infrastructure, as I said, also that we had in case of Via Ignatia on the roads and Ohrid, but also the monasteries facilitated the flourishing of both literacy, heterodoxy, and heresy. And orthodoxy, of course. We know that in the time of Stefan Nemanja, when Serbia advocated war to Bogomil heresy, these heretics have most likely come from Macedonia. Right, and now on those important people were Saint Clement of Ohrid, and he started persecuting Bogomils in 916. We know that Clement, after Cyril and Methodius, Slavonic followers became later fathers of the church. These were Saint Clement and Saint Naum of Ohrid, Gorazd, and Angelari. We know that Saint Cyril died and was buried in Basilica of Saint Clemente, and after that the Pope consecrated Methodius, who was invited by the Patriarch Photius to Constantinople, and he traveled along the Dalmatian coast and over Via Ignatia, passing through the cities of Ohrid, Pelagonia, and Thessalonica on his way to the capital. What is important to say is Clement and Naum were sent to the regions of Ohrid, Glavenica, and Devol, named Kutmičevica. Very soon, Clement's missionary deeds were fruitful, and he was ordained bishop of Trembica or Velika, a regional church center between Ohrid, Prilep, and Skopje. Consequently, the territory of the former bishopric of Heraclea of Pelagonia was included in the diocese of Trembica Velika. And the name of this area is, and the exact location of the diocese have been endlessly debated. We know that Saint Clement was born in around 840 in the historical region of Macedonia and originated from the Slavic population. Two main accounts of his life come from the lives of the saint, written in Greek and based on non-preserved Old Slavonic models. The first Vita of Saint Clement was composed by Archbishop Theophylact of Ohrid, and the second was written by Archbishop Demetrios Choumatenos. What we know is that additional information on Saint Clement can be found in Life of Saint Naum of Ohrid and in the Slavic liturgy. The center of Clement's mission was the elevation of Plaušnik, and to the west of Ohrid's old town and to the south of the fortress of Ohrid, where Clement had built his church of Saint Panteleimon. We know that his relics were transferred to the Church of Saint Bogorodica of Perivlepta. And what is important to say is that according to Saint Clement's extensive life by Theophylact of Ohrid and by the brief life, Saint Clement remained bishop of Trembica Velika in the period between 893 and 914. He ordained a number of priests, deacons, and lay readers. He translated and wrote a number of sermons. Ohrid was a spiritual center, as we saw, and there are some ideas among the scholars who put into connection the Bogomils and the St. Clement's Literary School. This is a very interesting question, and I think it should be researched further. And Jordan Ivanov, for example, mentions another important information. The icon in the Church of St. Clement represents miracles of St. Naum, who succeeded St. Clement. And St. Naum is portrayed in the mountainous region, fleeing from the Bogomils. This episode must have been anachronistic, but it shows that the Bogomils have spread in the Ohrid region, which is very, very important. That seems logical because the Bogomils, as the Orthodox Christians, both must have had books at their disposition in order to delve deeper in Christian precepts. And the infrastructure must have been the same. As we have mentioned the life of Hilarion of Moglena, who says there were a lot of Armenians, important number of Armenians and the Bogomils, and they liked to debate with the saint. That means that they were very well versed in Bible, and they had some training, so to say, and some important books at their disposition. At least the perfected spiritual leaders among them. So Saint Hilarion, as I said, persecuted numerous heretics in his region. We know that his entire episcopacy was marked by his struggle to extirpate heresy. And what we know that Hilarion found out many Manichaeans as well, Armenians and the Bogomils. We know that also the Monophysites, Armenians, lived in the region of Ohrid. What is important to say is in the 12th century, the entire realm of the Archbishopric of Ohrid was a proper battlefield in combating the heresy. And last but not least, important to mention the hesychasts. We know that the presence of hesychia as a important spiritual doctrine of the monastic strand and ascetic strand, which appeared in the 14th century, but even earlier we had some information about that. It's important that Ohrid was an important spiritual center, as I said, in the 11th and 12th centuries, and we have the eremitic tradition embodied in the monks Prochorczynski, Joachim Osogowski, and Gavrilo Lesniewski, as we said. But the forerunner of the anachoretic monasticism in the Archbishopric of Ohrid was John of Rila, but also the most important of these was hesychast Joachim Osogowski in the 11th century. And the possible thematic and aspirational, ideological and conceptual links which were attested between the hesychast and Bogomil inclined heretics in other parts of Byzantium should be brought into connection with hesychasts here in Macedonia, because they existed at the same time, hesychast monks and the Bogomil. So this is also one of the questions, research questions, which should be paid attention to. Did they come into to research their possible connections? As we know that monastery, for example, it was dedicated to Joachim Osogowski near Kriva Palanka. This just points to possible direction of research, as I said, according to which the Macedonian region was inhabited by anachoretes, hermits, as well as the hesychast and the Bogomils. And so it was really, really a very rich hub and artery on such a relatively small geographical space. We have so many peoples and traditions mixed. This is just the precept of hesychasm. And to conclude, medieval Macedonia represented a multi-ethnic and heterogeneous environment. We find Armenians, but also Jews. I didn't have time to tackle this. Slavs, of course, then Bogomils, Monophysite, Hesychast monks. And as I said, also it was a center of orthodoxy, but also of heterodoxy, a center and a crossroad. And we have such a high concentration of literary centers, orthodox and heterodox, and nodal points here in the region of Macedonia, which represents a rarity in the Byzantine world, but it should be furtherly researched, of course. The role of the Bogomils should be accentuated as the medial one, as carriers of literary traditions, especially non-canonical traditions, because we know that the Bogomils used and read some apocryphal texts, and it is also thanks to them maybe that we have some of those ideas preserved. As I said, the open questions on hesychasts, and furthermore, Macedonian Bogomilism should be observed as an important cultural heritage of both the Balkans and Europe, and which originated most likely, as we saw, in Macedonia. However, it should not be forgotten that the Bogomilism had various phases in its development. It should not be observed as a monolithic movement due to the fact that the Bogomil presence in Macedonia was attested from the early beginnings in the 10th century, all through the 14th century, which is also a rarity. It is not in other and in all parts of Byzantium where Bogomilism existed that we have it attested in all these centuries. Right, and Bogomilism should be seen as a process of exchange and maybe an important link in the chain of spreading literacy, culture, contacts. And there are other areas of research which we shall maybe mention later. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry if it was long or something. Thank you.
Бојана, благодарам за исцрпното предавање. Значи, предавањето на вистина во една сублимирана верзија го содржаше еден подолг хронолошки период во смисла на почнувајќи од антиката па се до средниот век и е фокусирано нели на патната мрежа, на археолошките откритија, на духовните центри, духовните појави и всушност главниот фокус беше богомилството. Јас секако имам прашање, но претходно ќе им дадам збор на колегите доколку имаат нешто да прашаат. Also, I would like to invite the colleagues which are online. If there is any question, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, you can raise hand.
Okay, I'm going to ask first. Actually, I would like to ask you, Boјana, in which aspect of Bogomilism you intend to focus your further research concerning the Bogomilism, especially if we take into consideration that we are very limited with the source material. Actually, we operated with the same source materials during the last period. So what is your idea about that kind of problem?
Yes, thank you, Maya. So what I think it should be done first, as is the case also for Serbia, not enough archaeological survey has been done, which of course depends. We are dependent on the resources also from the government and from other structures, but we need to do that. That's, I think, archaeological surveys are lacking. Then, yes, we don't have much materials, but of course the domain what you, Maya, do is, I think, very a promising one, and me too to some extent, is this folklore and textual and folkloric heritage. Namely, Bogomils should be placed in this domain of intangible and tangible cultural heritage, and should be like researched more and preserved. And the folk legends and traditions are very rich in dualist mythological motives, and also with some pagan popular religious motives and lay superstition. But there are some elements there also pointing to the Bogomil heritage. And it should be very meticulously researched and reread, and the sources should be reopened, these ethnological sources. And as I said, the connection between Hesychast in Macedonia and the Bogomils, I think maybe we should read open these archives in monasteries. I don't know if it has been done fully in Macedonia, and
no, not at all.
Yes, I think that may be one of the ideas, and the symbolic, because they shared some symbolic universe, some elements of the symbolic universe in common. The Hesychast, the extreme monastic traditions, and extreme some strands of Bogomilism. As I said, Bogomilism was not a monolithic moment there. There are many strands and many subcurrents maybe. So as I said, and I would like to invite young scholars and students to do the research in this important area of Macedonian heritage, and to be proud of it, of course, and to awaken their interest. So yes, and then of course the digitalizing tools, digital tools, which would allow us maybe to do this topographic, toponymic percentages research, and to see how really it was a dense network and a dense findings. I mean, network of findings here in Macedonia, which I think is exceptional. Yes.
Thank you. Definitely, folklore will be helpful, and we used to work with Andrew on that issue, and
Yes.
we have to focus. Unfortunately, in the Institute of Folklore in Macedonia, there is no digitalized archive which concern the legends which are reflected the Bogomil ideas, and maybe it would be useful if we make some efforts in that sense. Okay, if there is any question from the colleagues from abroad?
You can raise hands.
Да, има некој прашање овде?
Jeste, može i na makedonski, and I will answer in English, but you can ask me Macedonian as well.
Okay, I can take an impression fine, especially considering the fact that almost all the aspects, not only the organism itself, but considering all the broader aspects. In this regard, I would like to, you mentioned in your conclusion that it's a kind of phenomenon, Macedonia, because it is attested that Bulgaria is a big distance from the very beginning to the end, the 14th century. So how can you explain this phenomenon in a short so your impression about it?
Well, exactly. I think, yes, we should do more research on that, and really to preserve this as a particularity and the richness of a tangible and intangible heritage, Macedonian heritage. So maybe it's because its geographic position was nodal of Macedonia, and as I said in the beginning, I think we can observe Macedonia as a center and as a crossroad. Maybe they sprang out there, Bogomilism apparently, as it did, but then all the roads were there, and it was connected also to to the situations in political situations in Byzantium and resettling of so many people. And there were apparently so many peoples and ethnicities mingled there, and traditions like Orthodox and Heterodox. And I think it's due to the geographical position as well, because we had the sea, the Adriatic Sea, and then, you know, the other sea was on the east, and the mountains, which also protected and sheltered traditions as well as people. And yes, I think it's very specific and apparently very important region. Yes.
How can you explain the term heresy? Because it's a visit of the right religion. So if the Bogomism was heresy, how can you explain the phenomenon? Because it was, as you mentioned, it was maintained maybe the lower classes of people which were in opposition to the all in the continuity to the power.
Yes, and I think that also, yes, but geographically, the centers of power were distant enough to control everything, every kilometer of the country. And I think that is why we maybe we had Bogomils, maybe they found their shelter here as well, and they felt at home here. Apparently, we had this some accounts according to which Pope Bogomil was born here. And yes, so there must have been a deep tradition behind it, and the topography facilitated their protection and offered maybe a safe haven to those peoples who were not Orthodox but heretic, not heterodox, right? As we had Armenians, as we had Paulicians, you know. And it was the politics of the Byzantine Empire always to settle the heterodox populations at the outskirts, far from the centers of power, which is Constantinople at this point, right? So I think they found a nice place for them there in Macedonia, basically.
Yeah, because sorry about this. Well, it is very striking for me because you mentioned that Bogomism is present in Ohrid.
Yes.
Vision.
Yes.
Ohrid was at the center.
Yes, Orthodoxy.
The church
Yes.
even through Ohrid.
So okay.
Constantinople and Byzantium implemented their policy.
Yes, your question is why we have.
How can you explain that rightly in this region it was present all the time?
Because first we know that the modus operandi of the Bogomils was to go incognito. I think that was one of their ways of surviving all these centuries. They had their mode, and they were maybe not so different from Orthodox monks at the first aspect, at the first view, you know. And
Kind of self-defense.
yes, it was their kind of self-defense. And yes, Andrew Roach has a question I will ask. So I think that was the strategy, and they had to be near Ohrid because all the books were there, and the Bogomils were literate, very literate. At least the spiritual leaders of the Bogomils were very literate, and
Yeah.
so where you can read books, you cannot read books everywhere, and there is not a library everywhere like today, right? You had to be close to the center.
Especially times when the education was very limited.
Very limited to monasteries or to schools. Yeah.
Thank you.
So it was the infrastructure which was the same. Thank you very much, Mitko. So now I will ask Andrew Roach to ask us a question, please.
Hi, Boјana. Thank you for the paper. The village of Bogomil and the other villages around that area, I just wondered, well, what sort of ties them together socioeconomically? I mean, why there might be a good place for somebody like Bogomil to emerge? I was sort of put on it by the sort of lollard idea, which of course also comes from the idea of old women. But lollards, you can really sort of pick out a certain sort of economic group. They tend to come from the English Midlands or the Southeast because that's where the cloth trade was, and it ties a little bit back to your things about books, that there was a literate community there. I just want, obviously it's a slightly earlier period, but I just wondered if you sort of thought about the sort of socioeconomic context.
Thank you very much. This is of course very important question. Well, I don't know if we have a lot of information on our disposition, and why did it happen there. It must have been like a central position in the, it must have been a very protected, well protected position there, with a lot of natural resources which facilitated the existence. And I'm sure Maya also
will add that the terrain, Andrew, you know, it is very similar with those where the Cathars were. We spoke about it, very natural sources, in sense water, herbs, everything that fish, everything that you need for surviving in such circumstances, especially because we know that they realize the liturgy and rites in the nature, not in the buildings. So I think that was the ideal nature, a natural environment for emerging the heresy.
Yes, that's what I thought as well. So it was, you have a lot of natural caves and always mountains, like we know it was.
And space where and spaces where they could hiding themselves, which is very important, especially in times of persecutions.
Yes, but I'm afraid we don't have so many information as you do on the Lollards, so that is the big difference, unfortunately. Maybe we will find something, I don't know. I hope that not everything has been found, so.
Thank you. I thought the idea of looking at some of the monastic archives sounds actually very interesting.
Yeah, we should maybe do something about that. Thank you very much, Andrew. Do we have some other question from our participant attendees?
Ако не можем и
Okay.
за отслужение. Би сакала да се заблагодарам уште еднаш на сите што одвоивте од вашето време да присуствувате на предавањето на колешката Радовановиќ. Значи, постојат многу сличности во однос на милството, хетеродоксија, православието. Во овој контекст сакам да го спомнам нашиот млад колега Армен Жарновски, кој што туку докторираше и тој работеше на една тема каде што правеше паралели меѓу богомилството и суфизмот. Така што тоа е една широка тема која што навистина допушта различни интерпретации, споредби и така натака, и има навистина поле за понатамошно истражување и покрај фактот што нели ние сме лимитирани со изворен материјал, меѓутоа може да бидат од помош и од корист теологија и фолклорот, и секако на тоа да се фокусираме во иднина. Јас сакам уште еднаш да ви се заблагодарам вам, да се заблагодарам на аудиториумот, and also I would like to thank to all the participants which have been with us today. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all.
Благодариме Бојана, поздрави до сите.
Hvala. Jesi hteo pitanje, Mačej?
Не, јас немам шобере да ти кажам, ова не е мој терен, да ти кажам, ама прекрасно, се на место, супер.
Hvala,
Те молам, супер. Поздрави до сите, поздрави ја Маја. Здраво Маја. Поздрави од работа. Јас си во САП си седам и сега ве слушам, значи супер. Навистина прекрасно предавање, убаво. Ајде, уживајте, поздрави до сите.
Pozdrav, hvala.
Text.